Welcome to Cryptoland. I'm Krishna Andavolu. Today, it's all about the blockchain utopia. Obviously, Liberland is just one example of people getting crypto rich and getting a little ahead of themselves with what they can dream up. But they're not wrong about nation states being imaginary. It's just that whatever they replace them with risks having the same issues. Motherboard's Edward Ongweso Jr. and urban researcher Gillian Crandall are joining me to talk about how that might already be happening. Obviously, Liberland is a thing. It's happening in the real world too, if you want to talk about Liberland not being the real world. But tell me about Liberland, Gillian. Like, what is it? What are these people after? And what does it mean?
Well, my understanding is that this is essentially a crypto anarcho-capitalist nation come perhaps true. My understanding also is that it really stems from the foundation of a very explicit tax haven from the EU that people who are interested, who are self-proclaimed techno-libertarians, right libertarians, come together and form their own community. Mm-hmm. And what's happening is that this is landing in a highly contested territory, of course, on the border of Serbia and Croatia. And what we see is very much a terra nullius argument. Let's just stake a claim to a land without really any ideas about how this might implicate or make I guess, a case for, is it Croatian, is it Serbian? We don't really care. We're starting our own, nation. So
right.
That's my understanding, really.
Yeah, and micronations are things that have existed as kind of idea and thought experiments for a while. They can be funny and cool and interesting, a way of poking an eye at the concept of a nation state. But Edward, like, not only is it not Serbia or Croatia, but a lot of these people aren't actually from that region to begin with. It's attracting a bunch of people to the idea, to the festival, whatever. And yeah, they're libertarians, right? That's like in the name of the place. Talk to me about cryptocurrencies, the culture behind what brings people here as a result of these cryptocurrencies, and how libertarianism kind of plays into that.
Yeah, so libertarians, I think a lot of them, or maybe some of the more ideological ones among them, would consider themselves people who are taking this argument that emerges a few hundred years ago during the Enlightenment that you cannot trust centers of power, of authoritative power, right? Specifically the state. But for libertarians today, right-wing libertarians, they ignore, I think, some of the larger arguments that are at play there and solely focus on state power and end up advocating for systems where they might want to stay, but they also want the state to be to get out of the way of corporate power, of corporations or economic entities that are going to either run amok or they want like some sort of social system where they're rewarded for entering or that you're rewarded for building them up and supporting their ability to dictate life for individuals, I think. So here we see, like you talked about, a tax haven, but we also see a place where it's very clear that they're also not really concerned about what individuals have beyond the strict legal equality, right? There was a profile of the place, I think in 2016, that kind of opens up with like the Minister of Justice who wrote their constitution being like, okay, you're only equal before the law. We don't actually really care, what you are outside of it. You talk about how they don't really believe in suffrage and universal suffrage. In fact, if you pay more taxes, if you have more economic power, you should have more say over the system, while at the same time saying that this is a system that confers as much power as possible to everybody.
Well, let's talk about voting for a second, because I think that is a very interesting concept of what the blockchain could do, how the potential of the technology itself. The first question, and I'll get to that in a second, is like, how did that actually work? But secondly, like taking this idea that like in Liberland, it's not one vote, one person, it's like how much crypto you have equals how many votes you have. The best reading of that from my mind is like, that's kind of how it works in the world anyway. Like if you have a bunch of money, like you get to control politics in a way that you or I who don't have a bunch of money can anyhow. So it's a acknowledgement of the systemic injustices and power that already exists rather than dressing it up in a fancy constitution and like whatever. But is there something refreshing about hearing someone say, the way our country works is if you have more money, you got more political power. And so it's decentralized in a way, right, because of the blockchain, but it's also very much about who has more money.
Yeah, at least they're not couching it under narratives of, this is, we're all equal, although in some cases they are, right? It's this ironic difference between what the rhetoric is behind what is actually computationally possible. And when you say, that's how our system works anyway, in terms of voting, the rich can donate to political action committees and get their say in thuswise. Well, yeah, that's true, but the legal system does still say one vote, one person, one vote. And when you're computationally embedding a framework whereby the more cryptocurrency you have, the more voting power you have, it's very clearly an oligopoly. It's based on, wealth. And if they're transparent about that, then I suppose you can choose whether or not to be a part of that system. Where I get concerned is where these systems are being rolled out as a techno fix for a more efficient governance system that allows its citizens to participate in a voting structure that is being told is a very democratic voting structure. We're just increasing efficiencies because it's using computational technologies and using the blockchain, which is a very transparent, trustless system. People might say, yeah, absolutely, I want to get behind that. I like how that sounds, but maybe not understand that it's really the more tokens you have, the more votes you have, the more pull you have.
There's a difference, I think, between rhetoric and reality in traditional the political states that exist today and then what we see in the crypto communities. Like in the United States, there's always been a huge, of course, gulf between the rhetoric and the reality. You have a country founded with words about equality for all by slave owners, right?
Yep.
And you can argue that the rhetoric, at least some of the people convinced themselves they believed it and tried to push for shifts in the system that might realize whatever it is that they thought that they believed about liberty or equality. But in the crypto communities, the rhetoric is not really, I think it's more of like a Trojan horse or more of like a thing to appeal to people where the understanding they all have is that they are not trying to build like some society where everyone is equal. They're trying to build a society where there's more power given to corporations or to individuals with a lot of money, and they should have that power. They deserve to have that power, and we're going to construct a society and a social contract where that all makes sense. Mm-hmm. Versus some people coming and they're believing like, oh, by participating in this, we might make a better, more equal society. They're just there because they think like that. A minority shouldn't be controlled by a majority. And presumably, a minority that's paying the taxes, right? A minority that has the actual economic power. They should be unbridled and allowed to develop and guide the society as they see fit.
So how do you rebuild society based on the blockchain? What are the problems with even the concept of let's rebuild society based on the blockchain?
Well, I think first of all is that as the starting point, is using blockchain as the starting point, right? Now, it's a bit of an issue where you could say, I'm going to start my own society on blockchain, and this is what blockchain can do for you. But in the back of your mind, really, it's about, am I going to benefit? And am I going to get richer with this? Are my friends going to get richer? Now, as you said, blockchain is technically just a technology. It's just a tool, and how it's used, that's where it has potentially more potential. Now, the issue that we see is that these folks, they're not slowing down at all. They're just full speed ahead. And if anybody has any kind of notion about slow down, what are we doing here? How can we make this a little bit more equitable for people who are already living in these areas? Then those folks who are starting their own utopias, so to speak, are saying, no, you're standing in the way of progress, let's keep going. And so it is a speed issue. And these technologies can really act as techno fixes that are hard to roll back from. And so I think the question is, how can we maybe not use the technology as a starting point, but look at the work that is being done by grassroots organizations that have been groups that have mobilized on the ground, that have been working on issues around equity for many, many years, and have worked on a longer time scale. A lot of feminist practices, particularly in Puerto Rico, have centuries-long knowledges that are built up. And maybe instead of asking them to speed up and acknowledging the futility of techno-power from slowing down, how do we get to an alignment that can allow technologies to benefit or help some of the inefficiencies, or help connect diasporas, for example, of those movements that have already been making claims for many, many years. So not starting necessarily from one technology, but perhaps coming around to it if that is the right tool for the job.
It feels like the way that tech is usually developed, it's like idiosyncratic person with way too much money on their hand decides, like, I'm just gonna develop this thing, and then also I wanna make money off of it. And those blind us to the questions that we should be having each time we develop a new piece of technology, which is like, do we actually need it? Like, it may provide benefits and it may work out in some ways, but are the costs associated with it worth it? And I don't know. I think for a lot of the technologies that emerge related to cryptocurrency or related to the assets that emerge in that space, that's an open question because of the politics of a lot of the people that are involved, because these petri dishes that they're doing, they're in countries, they're in places that are already colonized or extracted from. They're not, like, the concern that's persistently there is that the people who are pushing this out want it to make money. They also have an ideological purpose or agenda behind it that would not fly anywhere else. And so they're using places to develop it and get away with something that they shouldn't, right? Even if there's a benefit, or even if blockchain could help us, should it be allowed to develop? Like, not every problem, I think, needs to have a technological solution. And in fact, I feel a lot of the problems that we have today come from this obsession with, we need to fix something with an app, with a startup, with like some billionaire's fever dream about like what society should look like, versus stepping back a little bit, like you said, thinking about like what other people have already done.
Mm-hmm. So this isn't like billionaires' fever dream of what society should look like. It's kind of newly minted millionaires from crypto trading enacting what they think society should look like. And I think, like, in a sense, it's like, it's not about the technology, it's about the people, right? That's the bottom line here. And what we should be paying attention to is, what is a culture that is attracting people to this technology and the communities that are formed around it. And so that's an argument, if I'm hearing you guys correctly, to pay attention to the culture. What would we look at it as the pillars of that culture? And of course, like, with the caveat that, like, we can't paint everyone with the same brush. But like, what is the portrait that's emerging?
There's an idea about being disenfranchised, right? And if you are able to finally have a voice, hey, I'm really good, I'm a tech savvy, I'm a developer, I'm a programmer, or I can pay those people. Usually what we see, in these cases, it's a relatively young man who is saying, what would the world be if I and my friends were able to solve all the problems? It really is a kind of white saviorism idea that goes beyond what we see with disaster capitalism. And there is a real conviction in many cases that this will solve your economic woes, this will solve all of the crises, but at the end of the day, I'm going to be benefiting and further accumulating my wealth, which was what you were getting at, which is honestly what we see for all of the narratives around decentralization. We actually do see urbanistically a case of re-centralization of crypto in areas that are currently marginalized or have maximum incentive for example, crypto mining. Where's the cheapest electricity? Where can we experiment? Truly, these guys, and I say guys because they are usually men, they have big personalities. They're very charming. They speak with authority, and they know what they're talking about. Whether or not they do or not, I don't know, but they sound like they do. So it's easy to get swayed by that. It is, and if I'm like-minded individual where I'm, sitting online and I don't have any power. How can I get some power? How can I get some money, right? What's this crypto thing? Oh, I'm on Reddit. Hey, my friends are in this. They say it's a good way to make some money. Let's go. It's kind of the same thing with right radicalization with the YouTube algorithm. Data and Society has a great study on this. It's just like-minded individuals getting further and further down the rabbit hole. But there's an energy to it. There's a party atmosphere. There's these conferences. It's Burning Man 2.0, Floating Man. And you do see a lot of Burning Man enthusiasts going into the crypto space, like Brock Pierce, like the case at Liberland.
That was very clear.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Puerto Rico, because I don't know what's happening there at all.
It's a bit of a different case. I would say it's much more enmeshed. This is something that since 2012, with Acts 20 and 22, provided a number of tax incentives for new technology-oriented businesses to come into Puerto Rico to establish their business.
Okay.
But in that, it's now transitioned to Act 60, and essentially it just means that anyone who comes in pays zero capital gains tax on their crypto. So because it is already a tax haven, you have a lot of people, it's a beautiful place, let's hang out with our friends, create this new crypto utopia. And as I was mentioning earlier, also because of the promoter services clause in some of these acts, they are even further incentivized to invite their friends, to promote their friends to come establish their business, which further tax breaks.
And these would be crypto businesses or any business?
It's particularly technology-oriented digital services.
Okay.
And so cryptocurrency is probably the main industry now that has been coming into the main island of Puerto Rico. But again, we see in these acts, there are no benefits that are comparable for already existing Puerto Ricans. It's only for people who are expats to come in and settle. It's a clear example of settler colonialism that is incentivized by the local government. The idea behind this is that it'll be somewhat of a trickle-down economic system. Well, we have new businesses that are setting up roots here. They'll be spending money on our local businesses, and we'll kind of get out of our economic slump. Particularly, we were earlier talking about these big personalities who come and have either gained their wealth through crypto or outside. Brock Pierce is the one visionary who has landed in Puerto Rico and really has dubbed this Puertopia. This is our own crypto utopia, and has couched it under narratives of progress, economic development, particularly after Hurricanes Maria and Irma. It's a case where Brock Pierce has really looked at this as of Puerto Rico like a blank slate, right? We're going to start over from scratch. We're going to rebuild. And the thing is, it's not a blank slate. Puerto Rico has been subject to over 500 years of colonialism for Spanish, then United States, arguably now United States, and now potentially crypto. And particularly in a settler colonial behavior, as I said, incentivized by tax incentives that are somewhat supported by the local government, they're within their rights to do so. But it's a question of who's designing the future of Puerto Rico. Is it these predominantly white men, Burning Man enthusiasts, but also from all over the world, truly, to determine what the future should be, or should it be Puerto Ricans themselves who have systemically been banned from doing so?
You say that they're looking at Puerto Rico as a blank slate. And I wonder if we're talking about specific personalities and what their thought processes are. It is a blank slate in that it's something being built today. Right, people who got really rich, that happened in the past. But the culture of it, the broader understanding of what cryptocurrencies are, what the blockchain is, what we can do with it, that's coming into the mainstream culture now. What is there to be happy about when it comes to cryptocurrency these days as it relates to communities, and what is there to be wary of?
I think that a lot of the rhetoric that has been established over the past few years kind of gets accepted and built on. So like, for example, this idea that decentralization in of itself is a political choice, a decision, and that's going to lead to less coercion, less domination. But decentralization in of itself doesn't do that when the individuals that are being decentralized don't have power to begin with, right? If you're inside of a system where the founders of it or the crafters of it have ideologies where maybe you shouldn't have as much power as someone else, or maybe you can't get enough money to have as much power as someone else, then I think it's important to step back and ask, like, okay, is decentralization actually helping make the world? If you're getting into crypto, listening closely to the rhetoric in that space is important, because a lot of it is being used or is used to obscure how, you might be able to be involved in some cool projects, right? And creating assets or communities that are interested in solving one problem or the next. But does the problem need to be solved, right? And who is not being involved in the decision-making process? And are you maybe hurting someone else just so you can do the thing?
Yeah, no, I think we have to also think about the differences between cryptocurrency being used as a digital currency versus blockchain projects, which pose to, increase efficiencies, decentralize, et cetera. In Puerto Rico, there was a local community-based cryptocurrency that I was quite excited about called Coqui Cash. And it was meant to be used just to transact within local businesses, et cetera. It never really took off. And primarily because Puerto Rico it's already got an existing digital divide, right? There's a lot of areas, particularly more rural areas, that don't have internet access at all. So that's not to say that you couldn't make that leap and improve broadband access first before rolling out your blockchain project or your community-based crypto project. But there's a lot of foundational infrastructural issues that need to be addressed first, which is an equity problem. Two, if we're looking at blockchain projects that are leveraging the exciting, potentials of the blockchain as a technological tool, there's many different cases that you could actually see this actually helping certain communities. For example, doing an ICO for crowdfunding for dispersed diasporas after Hurricane Maria. This was actually posed from a local young tech developers in Puerto Rico. Again, it didn't really take off. It was also at the wrong time with the ICO kind of bust, the kind of pump and dump schemes becoming much more aware. People were a little bit more hesitant to putting their money behind an ICO. But those were projects that inherently had everything to do to benefit for the local economy, the local population, and were designed by people who had lived there the whole lives. That's the difference. If I'm interested in developing a blockchain project, maybe don't try to export it and test it on somebody that isn't your own community. Maybe try doing it locally first.
Sometimes a problem doesn't need a solution. Like if you are someone in Silicon Valley or someone in some specific space, you might look at like an area where people can't get around as much. And I could see someone coming up with like some idea for mediated through exchanging coins or tokens of some sort, figuring out ways to get people or incentivize drivers to get people from point A to point B. There's also another solution. You just give people a bus, right? You create a transit system, right? There are alternatives outside of these techno fixes. And those often are not as alluring and they're not profitable the way that these ones are. And if people sit down with themselves and really ask why they're interested in a project, a lot of the time it does come down to like opportunity to make money and a belief or a sort of assumption of like the rhetoric and the ideas that are being fed about the promise of that project. Even though, as we've talked about, these projects are in of themselves. They have background politics. They have background, investors and interested personalities who have needs and desires and concerns which diverge from the public pretty sharply.
I would also say it's about how it's designed. So we got to talking about, is blockchain the starting point, or do you come back around and evaluate a number of other technologies that may solve your problem a little bit better than trying to be techno-solutionist about it? Or maybe it's not a digital technology at all. But I think it goes down to the framework of the design or how you're tackling a problem. In Puerto Rico, there's a strong history of economic cooperatives, primarily through credit unions, but worker cooperatives as well. And if a cooperative is coming around to grappling with what is blockchain technology, how do we figure this? Knowledge is one. Knowledge is one. And two, maybe a design of a blockchain cooperative would be very different than a techno-capitalist or crypto-anarchist project, right? It's in the frameworks of who's doing the designing, who sets up to benefit. Is it one vote, one person, or is it multiple tokens? The more voting power you get, that's where you get into problems with equity, particularly. But I do agree. Maybe it's not through one technology at all, but it's you have to grapple with this technology. You have to ask hard questions, and it takes time, and it's not sexy, it's not glossy, and it's not this buzz that Bitcoin and blockchain really hold for them.
It's both very loaded and in some cases very easy to say like, oh, neo-colonialism, or oh, this is crypto-colonialism or disaster capitalism. These are words that flow off the tongue, but I'm sure there are plenty of people who would disagree, right? Where it's like you're trying to make an economic zone in Puerto Rico, lift all boats by way of economic development. What are the specifics about the way that Puerto Rico is instituting this that leads you to the conclusion that you're making?
Yeah, I guess broadly the way that I would define crypto-colonialism is the coordinated act of individuals or groups settling in lands to exploit the land or laws for their own profit. Now, in and of itself, legally, they're within their rights. It's, in fact, local government through Puerto Rico is saying, come here, we want you to come here. You'll get a bunch of tax breaks, zero capital gains on your crypto assets, and if you start a new business, you can also have a range of tax incentives, but you must prove that you are exporting your services outside of Puerto Rico. If you establish a new digital company running on blockchain, you have to prove that your clients are outside of Puerto Rico.
Because that would mean that money from outside of Puerto Rico is coming to a Puerto Rico-based company, and then that money would be used in the community.
And to not compete with U.S. Interests in Puerto Rico, U.S. service providers who want to keep Puerto Rico as their dominant base. So to not have competition with U.S. companies. That's one example. You must prove that you're exporting your services outside, not benefiting local Puerto Ricans. Also, local Puerto Ricans are not able to get the same tax incentives if they were to start their own crypto-oriented business. Their own crypto assets are still taxed. Now,
Entrepreneur A starts a crypto business.
Yeah.
Entrepreneur A is from Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Entrepreneur B is from Connecticut. Entrepreneur B gets the tax break, but A doesn't.
Yes, provided that entrepreneur from Connecticut can prove that they're a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico. They must prove that they're living there. So it is an instance of settler colonialism, but it just so happens to be incentivized by the local government for, economic development purposes. Now, there's more.
But let me stop you on that, because it's like, okay, the local government said, let's do this.
They're within their rights, but it doesn't mean that it's not colonialism.
Let me just push back, because it's like the local government of Puerto Rico is comprised and voted for by people who live in Puerto Rico.
Yes.
So they're taking their mandate as a government to say, hey, we want to institute this program. And the rules, I would imagine, were agreed upon by those representatives of the people of Puerto Rico.
Yes, but But
So
Puerto
unlike
Ricans
colonialism,
yeah.
where a European power sent those to another place where the people who lived there didn't agree to them being there.
Right, but Puerto Ricans don't vote for the president. They don't vote in any federal elections. They don't have any representatives in Congress. So when rules and laws are being decided from congressional and federal level, it's not democratically elected. There's a local body. So I guess that we can contest like the ins and outs exactly of what's happening there and the legality of what's happening. But if you're a Puerto Rican, you live in a land that is owned by, but not part of, the United States. That is the word of the law. And because US, venture capitalists are coming in and settling in, that's nothing really new necessarily. There's been pushes towards a pharmaceutical industry previous to the new digital tech economy in Puerto Rico. Same thing with testing of war technologies in Vieques. Same thing with testing birth control on women in Puerto Rico without knowing what the risks are. Whether or not you want to call it colonialism or not, it's still experimentation on a marginalized population that does not democratically elect a representative in the federal government. Mm-hmm. So, if you want to say, well, they're just grasping at straws for some form of economic development, yeah, I mean, it's true and great. And some Puerto Ricans you'll talk to, and I have to say, I'm not Puerto Rican, so I am speaking on this just from the partnerships that I've established over there, and it is a big issue. I'm not the right one to speak on it, just full disclosure, but I will try to advocate for my colleagues where I can, and my friends who have been doing the work for many, many, many years.
So when we talk about the localities of where the culture of crypto is popping up and what that can teach us about this moment, is that there are elements that are just fishy, that are maybe fucked up, that could be called colonialist, depending upon what kind of hat you want to wear, but nonetheless are demonstrative of where we are today. Basically, if you know about this shit, you're great. If you don't, you are cut out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that, I guess the skeptic in me would be like, well, that sounds like basically everything, right?
But that's also part of the problem. Everything sounds like that because most of the ways in which money still travels in the same patterns or same paths as those carved out by those empires long ago.
I see.
Like fiber optic cables follow the trade routes of like the early empires. Like most of or in their early trade routes. A lot of the money, a lot of the families, a lot of the structures, a lot of the the frameworks on which people trade or make money were founded in those. And I think like exactly with some of these countries where crypto has been popping off, you have also places that, they were historically colonies. You have places where the people who dominate the country are also historically trained or educated or ingratiated in the networks of the people who are in this country and dominating this country. So it ends up being like a colony in almost everything but name, it feels like, right?
But what you're doing is you're offering ideas of proposing an alternate ideological stance of a blockchain technology or a cryptocurrency that isn't necessarily about libertarianism.
Yeah.
Because that's where, if I'm hearing you guys correctly, the problems emerge from the misapprehension that libertarianism is a neutral position, when in fact it's a very self-promoting position. And that these moments and notions of self-promotion, when collectivized and then when put in different places, can be at the expense of the people who live there and can be delusional that it's not about just you.
Yeah.
So I guess the broader question is is there another way of looking at crypto, at blockchains that aren't through the libertarian lens?
Many of the cases that we actually see now as posing rollouts of blockchain projects are basically neoliberal projects where the government wants to seek greater efficiencies for their operations. This is what's happening in Puerto Rico, right? How can we, absolve ourselves from responsibility, place it in the hands of a computational process, and kind of sit back and let it do its thing? So it definitely does dovetail well with neoliberal logics behind letting private companies, corporations do the work of the government. And that's what's happening in Puerto Rico has been happening with the power authority that got sold off. And I think it also dovetails well with existing capitalist industry. You don't have to be a right libertarian to support blockchain because there's this fear of missing out. Right? How can banks further increase their own efficiencies? So everybody's getting in on the game, so to speak, and blockchain has just become another capitalist industry at the end of the day. So for the people who are saying, oh, blockchain has radical potential to break apart the existing system, in practice, we do see the status quo just being replicated just with a new technology.
And is there anything particularly ironic about that it's blockchain, or is that just like, everything? That's how everything gets subsumed into the machine that spits out dollars so we can buy sodas and stuff.
The problem is when you're implementing blockchain, you're creating a techno fix that is very hard to roll back from, particularly if you're enacting smart contracts, which prevent certain people from acting in certain ways. So the whole idea about flexibility, about rewriting some of the rules, that's going to be even harder to do once it's encoded in a digitally managed system. It's hard to roll that back.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. So it's like the people who are saying that all of this liberates everyone, they're also saying that it does so in an anti-democratic way, right? And it is literally or structurally will end up being like a sort of anti-democratic structure. I think like just looking at it, it's like turtles on turtles on turtles on turtles of just like, this is not how you should build a fucking society, just labeled all over them. And it's attractive, it's alluring, but I think on a closer look, you realize there are a million problems on top of the fact that we have a million problems we have not solved. And they're proposing like, okay, what if we get around the democracy problem by just not being a democracy?
It's become apolitical.
Right,
it couches itself as an apolitical technology when in fact it's just further entrenching a certain politics within the technology, absolving themselves of that responsibility.
Okay, so in El Salvador, I guess the basic question is, who's doing what there? And how is it based on crypto exactly? And then like, why is it a problem?
So what you have there is you have both the president, signaling intention to, make a cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, acceptable alongside dollars, and to set up infrastructure to mine it more and set up infrastructure for businesses to accept it as payment. In addition to investors coming in and saying that we'll back those projects, we'll develop them, we'll help expand them. I think the problems that emerge are that, especially at the outset of the project, some of the investors remaining anonymous. Instead of, trying to talk with people in the area, trying to, plan some sort of establishment of what the infrastructure will look like, what businesses might need it, how to support people if they don't have enough money to put their business entirely in crypto. Just pushing it along, and I think moving with that mentality of like move fast and break things and worry about it later, right? So the concern here, the real problem is that for people in El Salvador, if they're going to shift entirely onto crypto, right, their wages, their wealth are going to be more vulnerable to it, to swings up and down, but also essentially their pockets will be skimmed in the meantime by people who already have large holdings in crypto, right? I'm going in and I'm buying crypto and I may help provide some upward momentum to the price by shifting my wages into it and by using it as tender in my country, and then we're all going to be doing that. But in the meantime, when it goes down, it screws me and everyone I know over, but it's going up and it's going to add more to the pockets of these people who came in, set it up, and made us all adopt it and expose our livelihood to it.
So that's what's happening in El Salvador. Basically, the president was like, hey, in addition to the US dollar, which is their official currency, we can use Bitcoin as an official state currency, which is also ironic, right? So the question that I want to put to the table then is, under the guise of economic development, which is to say like, hey, we can make a special economic zone, we can improve our money infrastructure by making Bitcoin payments something that's universalized. It's a real experiment in like when the rubber hits the road with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin being used widely and for just regular regular commerce, not just trading and speculation. Why is it still something that's still about speculation? Is it just a crypto like colonialism? Is it like disaster colonialism? Whatever. Like, why is it fucked up?
Well, I think the reason why it was being implemented was to reduce remittances that people would have to pay fees abroad for family living overseas, as well as making a case where you could transact locally using Bitcoin. Another reason why Bitcoin was so that you could bank the unbanked. This is another narrative we hear in many other countries, a lot of concentration in the global south. But just allowing people to use Bitcoin is not necessarily going to help people establish banks if that's a thing that we actually want to do. A lot of El Salvadorians don't have access to documents that can allow them to establish bank accounts. So it's a techno fix that is somewhat of a Band-Aid, but also just way much more of an experiment. And this has a very strong legacy tied with colonialism. Histories of experimentation on marginalized populations or populations deemed experimentable, just because this is the first rollout. But it's because Bitcoin is still incredibly volatile, it is so risky to put these people in that position that may not actually ever be able to accumulate any sort of measurable wealth or living expenses for themselves if this were to tank. So it is very much an experimentation through colonialism, even though it's self-sanctioned from the president.
The people who are setting up are not from there. The people who are financing it are not from there. The people who are driving the direction in which it will develop are not from there. The people who are thinking about ways to phase in or phase out, groups of people in the experiment, if they, whatever form it takes, they're not in control. It's a bunch of people who are made wealthy by it because they were, one, already wealthy enough to take advantage of that first wave of bubbles for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, or two, have locked into the money and are also networked enough to convince other people to come down with them, right?
Also, there's these claims around disintermediation. It's just a one person to one person transaction. But there are so many new intermediaries that are popping up. So for example, the new wallet that in El Salvador that people need to use is a government-sanctioned wallet. Who knows where there might be skimming off the top here and there? We don't know, because there's sort of a lack of transparency, although they would say, this is completely transparent, it's on the blockchain.
Yeah.
So there's these new intermediaries. It's just a case of, do you trust in a regulated central bank that has regulatory controls, or do you trust the bank of Jack Mallers with the Strike exchange platform? But for example, you're right, like the El Salvadorans don't really have an option. If you are a business that has an internet connection, you must accept Bitcoin payments. That is the rule.
So Edward, talk to me about the difference between the president of El Salvador making Bitcoin like one of the legal tenders and what's happening at Bitcoin Beach. Like,
Right.
What's that?
So Bitcoin Beach is this sort of surf town, where the anonymous investor came in with, through a proxy, enough money for the people in the town of like 2,000-3,000 to fully shift to Bitcoin, right? It provides everything in Bitcoin, or it provides their wages into Bitcoin. Laborers will go there and get their wages. And Bitcoin also tries to, get vendors in the area or merchants in the area to go onto the Bitcoin as well. They've set up like a sort of headquarters, a house from which they kind of oversee the operation or the attempt as they carve out an area to move fully onto Bitcoin. And this is an independent project, I guess, or an independent investor project that also dovetails a little bit into what's going on with the president's move with the Bitcoin law. So the Bitcoin law is this law that was passed, in the dead of night, essentially, to mandate that all businesses would have to, transact or trade in crypto, specifically Bitcoin. And this is in a country where most of the people do not have bank accounts, do not have reliable access to the internet. But the bill is structured and was partially written by this guy who runs Jack Mallers, whose company owns an app on which people will be able to transfer their money into Bitcoin. But the problem is that they also didn't have infrastructure. So the law also demands that you're supposed to build out all of this, right? You're supposed to mandate that all the vendors have Bitcoin so that they can trade in Bitcoin. And you're also supposed to mandate that the government set up the infrastructure so that people can have Bitcoin when they don't have payments infrastructure, when they don't have banking infrastructure, financial infrastructure in general.
I mean, that's ambitious.
Yeah.
So that's what's confusing, is that there's this larger thing happening in all of El Salvador with the Bitcoin law, but then there's this small place called Bitcoin Beach, which is even more of like an intense crucible for trying to figure out how a world would look solely reliant on Bitcoin.
Yeah, in Bitcoin Beach, everything is more or less Bitcoin only, right? You're getting paid in Bitcoin, you're paying for everything in Bitcoin. The people there are more or less expected to only operate in Bitcoin. It's also a tourist destination. Right?
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a marketing ploy, right? It even sounds good, Bitcoin Beach.
But I think we've reported on it a bit about how even though it feels that way, the people who are tourists are not really interested in it, right? It's really for the people who live there. They have to go through this long process of getting onboarded into the app that is owned by the guy who helped write the bill. Coincidence.
So this would be a very clear instance of like an outsider with outside interests using Bitcoin as a way of conducting a social experiment on a bunch of people who live in the global south.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, isn't it cool that this guy is giving a bunch of Bitcoin to a bunch of people in El Salvador?
Is it? I mean, I don't know. If we knew who he was, I think it would. Maybe if you because to know who he is, you'd have a better sense of why. But without that, all we can do is just look at what's there, and what's there is that they are trying to get everyone onto Bitcoin so that, or at the same time as the country doing it, predating it a little bit, as a larger effort to try to insist or show to people, hey, Bitcoin can replace currency, right? But not really asking, caring, or being interested in if the people there actually want to live in Bitcoin. And as if you go to the vendors and you talk to them, it's a frustrating process, right? Because if you have a business that is not only dealing with stuff in Bitcoin Beach, before the law was passed, you would have to, still cash out constantly and then lose money in fees, lose money in, the fluctuation of the value of Bitcoin, right? And now that the law is in place, I mean, if you have any vendor, merchant that deals with anyone outside of the area, still the country, you're still gonna lose a good chunk of your money to all, the skimming off the top that has to happen in terms of fees, or again, in the fluctuation of the value of the currency, right?
Now, why is it that this person who donated this Bitcoin for this experiment remained anonymous to begin with? Do we even know that?
I can only really speculate. I mean, it's almost certainly they just didn't want the attention, right? Because you would get a lot of attention if you decided to make a town of a few thousand people only rely on Bitcoin.
Is it just a money laundering hub? I mean, though Bitcoin is kind of marked, right? But
yeah, we look at the Silk Road.
I mean, that's a question. That's an open question, because there are a lot of assets, there are a lot of things in crypto world where money laundering is is this what's going on? Is that a picture of a rock that's being sold for a few $1,000s, part of a money laundering scheme? Is an effort to convert an entire city's or entire town's economy to Bitcoin going to be used in one way or another to do money laundering? I don't know. I think you'd have to take a closer look at the books, but it exists, right? Money laundering is used with these.
And then
crypto.
again, it's another instance where a localized economy is being determined by an outsider with a cryptocurrency at the center of the reasoning why, which is this whole concept we've been talking about.
Yeah, and it's offered as this is for their own good, right? That we are doing this because in the long run, it'll be worth it. You'll have Bitcoin. You'll be only doing things at Bitcoin. Bitcoin will be more valuable, and you'll thank the shadow investor for it.
Which, I mean, might play out poorly in the ways that we've talked about, but also Bitcoin's probably going to go up, right? So might work out for the people there too.
I mean, yeah, I think with Bitcoin's value, we all can agree that what its value at right now is not what it will be in the future. But there's no way to tell. There's no way to tell how far up or how far down.
It could be exactly the same in the future, though. That is a possibility.
That's a possibility. You're right.
At the end of the day, it's just an experiment, though, and the people who have the most to lose are the local citizens. The people who have the most to gain are the ones who are running the exchanges, who are running the intermediaries, the wallets, etc. And we know who those people are. It's the Jack Mallers. It's the people who are couching this under we're saving a population. So if you were to give a bunch of money, Bitcoin or otherwise, US dollars, doesn't really matter what it is, and say, here, as an autonomous group, you and your neighbors decide what you want to do with it. Mm-hmm. And then you leave the scene. I think you'd have a completely different scenario of what might be playing out than what we see now with Bitcoin Beach.
But it always drives the development of technology.
I think what usually drives or has driven some of the major advances in tech have been like the state coming in and saying, you get a monopoly, and then we'll give you scientists and research and
like the internet.
Yeah. And then capital will come in and say, let's make a consumer-facing development or a business-facing development, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that the major drivers of innovation are or should be like private desire for profit, right? And in this instance, a lot of what ends up happening with the way that we're going to see or seeing like the early stages of crypto and the early stages of blockchain develop is how can we create infrastructure for payments? How can we create infrastructure for replacing all of the roles of tender in your country? How can we use it in one way or another to reaffirm everything that we already do in today's society, but with crypto?
Yeah, and I think there are some projects we can look to as alternate design around cryptocurrency that isn't just purely profit-driven. For example, the Faircoin case in Catalonia with Faircoop. Now, it was founded under cooperative principles and implemented, it did a good job in terms of democratic organization. Of course, the issues that they're running into is, well, maybe we don't agree in the way that this should move forward. And so you have a fork that comes off. And it's never an easy solution, but just acknowledging that it's not an easy solution and staying with the trouble, as Donna Haraway would say, let's just spend some time and work through this. And rather than just saying limitless innovation, perhaps alternate systems could have alternate values aside from profit. There's some projects that might dovetail with the degrowth movement, with platform cooperativism, for example. And I'd love to give more examples of alternatives. They just haven't been built yet. And it's hard to see how they can contest with the dominant power structures that are playing out around these libertarian narratives. But let's see more of them. Let's build the projects if it makes sense, but stay with the trouble.
I feel optimistic, right?
We'll see. I do want to say, innovation in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. Technology in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. It's in the frameworks of how it's used.
And I just want to take a quick step back. It's like you guys are very smart people and have studied this to an interesting degree and know a lot more about it. But is there a possibility that we can't see the future? That these small bits, these small places that are attempting to be kind of crucibles of crypto are portending, I guess, can't it work out? Yes,
I would love for
a
it
lot
to
of
work
signs
out.
that are there that hey, this might be messed up. This is reminds us of this or that. But could it be that we're just sort of caught in the boxes of our own thinking, our own, we can't imagine a future that doesn't look like the past, And since we're at the moment of inflection, we are transposing our concepting of what the past was onto what an imagined future would be. I'm trying to tease out, like, yeah, signs are there, but maybe we're just looking at the wrong signs.
I think cryptocurrency will definitely work out, but the problem is, like, for who, right? I think that is the real question. Like, we are concerned about patterns and signs and frameworks that suggest and have always led to in the past something working for a very small group of people who will just use it to move on to the next thing that they will make work for a very small group of people, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there within every creation or trend or phenomenon, there are seeds of other futures that are present, right? But the question is, like, are they getting cultivated? Are they getting paid attention to? Are they getting nurtured? And in a lot of instances, it doesn't feel like that to me. Mm-hmm. I don't know, like, what do you think as well?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to look at who's designing the system, who's it setting up right now to benefit the most, and who has the most at stake to lose. And like I said before, if it's a kind of ground up project that is set up to benefit, a local economy, great. Otherwise, if this project just makes a bunch of El Salvadorians rich, great. But it's also set up to make the existing rich even richer. And if we are aware of that, then just call it like it is, okay. But yeah, in terms of design, design has a lot of power of who's doing the design, who's set up to benefit. Right now, it's hard to see how local communities can get their elbows in and try to make change from within a system when it's, as we have been talking about today, very much a replication or a computational embedding of the status quo. I'd love to see it work outside of that, though, and perhaps with raised awareness of some of the contesting positions around cryptocurrency and blockchain projects more generally, we'll have more projects to raise up as alternatives. And I am optimistic, though I'm not a techno-optimist per se. I don't think that all technology we have to throw in the trash.